Do you have it for later, for the end?
No. Okay. Good to go. Oh yeah, yeah. Okay. Good.
Hello and welcome to our second non-profit data virtual seminar series. My name's Alasdair Rutherford. I'm a professor of social statistics at the University of Stirling in Scotland. So in this series, we're presenting research work that uses data on, about, or from the non-profit or voluntary sectors. And through these seminars, we aim to make research using data more accessible and also want to encourage international collaborations and data sharing amongst researchers in a range of fields who are interested in non-profit sector. So the format of the seminar will be a presentation of 30 to 40 minutes on a piece of research, followed by questions. You can ask questions at any time by using the YouTube comments. Unfortunately, you do need a Google login to make a comment. We'll collate these questions. We'll put a selection of them to the presenters after the talk. We also have a discussant ready to pose some questions to our speakers as well. We aim to finish the seminar in about an hour, and we've asked the presenters to share their slides, so they'll be available after the recording as well at the same link. So today we're joined by two speakers, Lecy from Austin State University and Nathan Grasse from Carleton University. Both have a strong track record of using large administrative data sets and data science to answer research questions on the management and governance of non-profit organizations. And as luck would have it, we're actually all in the same place today as well, which is great. So Jesse and Nathan will be sharing the presentation duties, and they're going to tell us about their work on the gender pay gap for non-profit executives. So over to you.
So I'm Lecy, Nathan Grasse, and we're going to be talking about a project that's using some new IRS data to look at robust estimates of the gender pay gap in the nonprofit sector, and then some ideas for how we might use research to look at what best practices are able to minimize the pay gap. So the main question for this project is we observe gender pay gap across most industries. It's something where at the executive level, it ranges from 10 to 20% across different industries, where male executive directors or managers are being paid more than their female counterparts. The question in the nonprofit sector is, given the representation of women within the nonprofit workforce, it's approximately 70% of the entire nonprofit workforce in the US is comprised of women. Would we also expect to see this pay gap there? One consideration is that even though it's the majority of women who are doing the work, there's still a minority of leaders within the field as well. So do we expect to see the pay gap? How large is it relative to other industries? And then are there things that can be done about it? The first analysis we'll present is from a paper by several co-authors on the pay gap in the nonprofit sector. We're using panel estimates with this new data.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of co-authors on this paper, Brianne Heidbreder from Kansas State University and Sharon Kugel-Acevedo from Central Michigan University.
So this paper, again, is looking at this pay gap, and one important question is, where does the pay gap arise from? What are the causes? And the literature has identified a lot of important factors. There are things like explicit or implicit bias within the hiring processes. You might think about a pool of women who are applying for leadership positions within organizations, a pool of men who are applying for leadership positions within organizations. And they might be applying for jobs at high-paying firms and low-paying firms. If you have, more men who are selected for the high-paying firms than women, that's an example of explicit bias. And if you compare the average salaries of all the men and women holding those executive positions, then that could cause an increase. Another factor, though, might be a sorting process. So there's the idea that men and women might prefer different types of jobs, and so they might be applying to these jobs at different rates. Another theory is about kind of instead of the glass ceilings, there might be glass walls where women might be promoted at different rates within an organization. And so that can lead to lower levels of kind of leadership or managerial experience, which then make them less likely to be competitive for the executive jobs when they're available. Also, when you are hired for jobs, if you have less leadership experience in the past, you might get paid less as a result of those credentials. And then additionally, you've got caretaker obligations, which overwhelmingly fall on women within a lot of industries. And this would be raising children, caring for elderly parents, other sorts of responsibilities that can lead to time away from the workforce, or just can limit the amount of time that you can spend at the office if you have to leave early to pick kids up from school or come in after dropping them off from school. That can lead to instances where you require flexibility and you're willing to trade off flexibility for other sorts of compensation. It can have lots of implications for those sorts of things. So these are some of the origins, and they overall will lead to observed pay differences. One important caveat to this: when you look at the pay gap literature, you actually have a couple of different definitions of pay gaps. One of them is if you just compare all of the men within their positions to all the women within their positions. And so you're just taking a cross-section of the data and looking at average salaries based upon gender. In that case, what you're going to be picking up is the sorting process. So if there are preferences for the types of positions and or else the bias that leads to differentials in hiring processes, those will manifest in the different average pay rates for men and women within those leadership positions. Those are a lot harder to identify because preferences might be natural preferences and do not originate from discrimination, but they can also be as a result of norms or gender norming or different processes that might make certain industries hostile for certain individuals, and people are less likely to apply for them, even though they're higher compensation jobs. That's a consideration in this literature. And then, all of that sorting process is extremely complicated, and it is cumulative over the entire careers. The other hand, the type of pay gap that we're going to be looking at within this paper is specifically if you hire two people for the same position, do you see differences in how those individuals are compensated? A lot of this literature is drawing from, maybe mid-level managers within corporations. So it's within the same organization. The mid-level managers all have similar levels of responsibilities. And then if you observe a pay gap in that instance, then that says something about they're doing the exact same work, but they're getting paid in different ways. And so that bypasses kind of the sorting process. We're not looking at the history of how the person arrived at the position, but rather once they get there, how are they being compensated for the work that they're doing?
Yeah, so specifically looking for differences within category of employment to try to account for some of those other alternative explanations.
The data we'll draw upon is partly the IRS e-file data. This is a new data set that allows us to observe the compensation variables. And this is what's going to allow us to create a panel so that we can leverage some changes in leadership to look at very precise estimates of the pay gap. We're also using the NCCS core data sets and business master files, which have general characteristics of nonprofits and nonprofit financials. And then for the gender coding, we'll be drawing upon Social Security Administration data. So the data set that enabled this project that's allowing us to look at these is a new e-file data released by the IRS. Essentially, the IRS started accepting electronic filings for the 990 forms from nonprofits in 2010. And so they had about 1.5 million filings on record. In 2015, there was a lawsuit filed to make these accessible. And so the IRS was required by federal mandate to release all of this data. So in 2016, they posted the data onto an Amazon web server, and it became public. The problem is that the data was in this XML format, which makes it really hard to use for research because statistical analysis requires rectangular data sets. And this is a semi-structured sort of data. It makes it really hard to read and interpret in the statistics programs. So as a result, there were several challenges for coding this. Another challenge is that the nonprofits can file several types of forms. The forms change at several periods in time. And as a result, if you're trying to look at one variable like total revenue consistently over several time periods, you need to be able to reconcile that variable across a bunch of different types of forms to ensure that you're actually measuring the same thing. And these are all different databases. As a result, building this data set actually was a lot more complicated than we expected. It required a lot of work to reconcile all the different forms and versions and to get that data into a rectangular format. So that's where this nonprofit open data collective has emerged. This is a group of academics and industry experts that all have interest in this data. It was quickly recognized that we're all working on the same problems and encountering the same challenges. So we started a conversation and began meeting regularly. It's resulted in a set of kind of protocols and standards for trying to extract this XML data and to place it into research databases that can be used by academics and practitioners to extend our knowledge in the nonprofit sector. The really exciting part about this is that traditionally, if we look at the data sets that have been released by NCCS, they might have about 200 variables. They're primarily financial variables. On the 990 forms, in total, it has 4,000 different variables available. So, we are extending the amount of information we have on the nonprofits by about 20-fold. It gives us a lot more opportunities to do some interesting studies with the nonprofit data.
And the research we talk about at the very end of this presentation will be a good example of that, because we'll be using some of the schedules that are now available to look at things like compensation that provide additional information that we've never had in the past. So it really helps us to try to understand the pay gap and potential remedies in ways we never could before.
We extracted the compensation data from the e-files. We had approximately 12 million observations that include all of the managers and board members from the 1.5 million nonprofits that had filed. And so this was from 2010 to 2016, which gave us a nice panel. And we're going to use that panel to leverage a specific sort of identification strategy, which is not just comparing the average salaries of all the men and the women within the leadership positions within the organizations. Instead, we're going to use a specific within organization estimate where we're going to isolate all the cases where the nonprofits have a leadership transition. So they're hiring a new director or a new CFO. And then we'll look at what happens specifically in those instances if the outgoing director is a male and they're hiring a female, or if the outgoing director is a female and they're hiring a male, or else if it's a male outgoing, male incoming, female outgoing, female incoming. We can use all of these cases to try to understand how, in the net, how are nonprofits treating compensation differently when different sorts of people are filling the same position. So the year is structured as a panel. If you look at the fiscal years, what often happens is the executive director is not necessarily going to start exactly at the start of a new fiscal year. So the way that we identified these transitions is we use the names of the directors within the data set. And then we look for instances where the names were changing. And in those instances, the year that we observe a name change would be year equals T. So that's the first year that that person is being reported as the new director, but that year is oftentimes an overlapping year. So we need to use data from T-1 and T+1 in order to ensure that we have the 2 years that are complete salary years for those individuals. So we do need 3-year panels at least and to observe a leadership change within that 3-year period within the panel in order to use that data. All right, so again, we were able to isolate the directors and the CFOs from that data set. On the IRS form, it reports the name of the individuals, the position they hold, and then their salary broken out into a few different categories. But it doesn't report gender. So for the pay gap paper, we need the gender of the individuals. We can code that by hand if we have a few dozen observations, but in this case, we have 12 million. So how do we do it in this case? Well, this is not something that you can do on your own. You're going to need some computational power for this. So we turn to R and some of the tools within R in order to leverage some interesting APIs. Specifically, there's a package in R called the gender package. This is using an API available through the Social Security Administration. And what that API does is allow you to send a name of an individual and then a time period, and it will match that individual's first name against the database of all of the birth certificates in the United States. And then it will just calculate a proportion of males that had that first name and the proportion of females that had that first name.
And for those of you who are in other countries, it does have options to reference other applications in order to gender code based on other nations. It's in the documentation available with the package.
So the exercise was taking this list of names within the data set, which was extremely messy. It's a unstructured text field, so people could enter whatever they want. So you get a lot of different instances of how those names might be structured. But the gender is specifically based on the first name. So you need some text analysis tools in order to extract those first names. You need to find a bunch of rules just in terms of how you might clean this data to remove all the non-relevant components and then to try to find all the first names from that. So we used a lot of pre-processing, identified those first names, used this API then to query the birth certificate data, and what it returns is something like this, which tells you for any given name, the proportion of individuals with that name that are male and the proportion that are female, and then it reports the mode for that gender as well, and then you can adjust the years if you know the dates of that you're looking at. In this case, we didn't, so we just used the default, which is 32 to 2012. But over time, some names might change slightly. The good news is if you look at the total set of names, this is a histogram looking at the proportion or the probability of people with a given name being a male. And so what you see is that the data is it's going to cluster either at the 1 or at the 0, meaning that most of the names that we have within our data set are almost entirely men or almost entirely women. There's only a handful of names that are kind of the ambiguous names where 30–40% of the individuals might be one gender or the other. So it results in very little measurement error using this technique, and you can quickly code millions of observations with this process. All right, so we coded the genders. We isolated all of the transitions to new executive directors or new CFOs using the names of the directors within the data set. Now we have this nice panel. We're using only the instances where the nonprofits have the transition. And we're going to apply a difference in difference model then to estimate the pay gap. The nice thing about a difference in difference model is it doesn't assume that all of your observations are the same in the pre-treatment period. In this instance, on the left, what we have are the outgoing executive director salaries. And so the organizations that are going to hire a new male executive director might be different than the organizations that are willing to hire a female. There are some industries where you just have very few female executive directors across a lot of the organizations, like hospital CEOs, university presidents. These tend to be dominated by male executive directors. In other instances, you might have kind of 50–50 representation for male or female directors. So we want to ensure that we're accounting for some of those selection processes. So we're not going to treat them all the same. But what we're going to do is look at what happens when an organization, in this case, we're starting with all baseline male CEOs. What happens when an organization replaces an outgoing male CEO with an incoming male CEO? And then what happens when an organization replaces an outgoing male CEO with an incoming female CEO? So what the difference in difference model allows you to do is to use the patterns, kind of the whatever the replacement premium is for the male-to-male executive directors, and then use that to estimate what the counterfactual would be for the female director if she were getting paid the same as what the incoming male executive directors are getting paid. And so we're going to use that to estimate this difference in terms of the pay gap. So one example of this, this is some of the actual data that we're using. We're looking at group level averages for all of the organizations that start out as male and are hiring replacement executive directors, either male or female. In this case, the organizations on the left, they're actually compensating their outgoing executive directors very closely, $206,000 versus $207,000. And when they are hiring then the incoming executive director, what we observe is that when you are recruiting a new male executive director, you end up paying a recruitment premium. So you're paying $14,000 more to take the job and start as the new executive director. On the other hand, when you are hiring a new female executive director, they're getting a pay penalty. So they're actually getting about $10,000 less than what the outgoing executive director was making. And so using that counterfactual analysis, if the women were getting the same recruitment premium as the men within our study, they should be getting a $14,000 pay bump, but instead they're getting the $10,000 penalty. And so the pay gap is actually that $24,000. difference. All right, so this is these are the results from the difference in difference model, looking at just the transitions in executive director salaries. So the main findings from this study, in the net, we observed about an 11% pay gap for both executive directors and chief financial officers within our samples. So again, there's a limited sample of e-filers and also restricted to only the organizations that are hiring new directors within the observation period we have. So it might be limited in terms of some of the generalizability, but from the internal validity perspective, we think it's a pretty robust estimate. And what we see is, we do observe a pay gap, but one of the interesting results that was we didn't anticipate necessarily starting is that it matters a lot kind of who the outgoing executive director is. So the story is slightly different if it's a female replacing a male executive director, or if it's an incoming female replacing an outgoing female executive director. What is interesting is that if you are replacing a male, you're getting that penalty of about $10,000. So you're getting paid less than the previous director for the exact same position within that organization. However, if you're replacing an outgoing female, you're getting about a $10,000 pay bump compared to what the salary was. So there is a recruitment premium to bring in that new female executive director. So in some ways, it seems more fair replacing the female, except for if you're a male replacing a female executive director, you actually get a much bigger pay bump. It's about $23,000 in that case to recruit that new male executive director. So even in that instance, even though there's not a pay penalty, there is still a pay gap in that. But the kind of the fascinating result is that the pay gap is slightly less if you, in the cases where the baseline outgoing directors are female. The pay gap is greater when the baseline outgoing directors are male. But if you look at the comparison of the incoming female executive directors, you're actually making a lot more if you replace a male than if you replace a female, the 197 versus the 171. So even though it's more fair in the instance where you might be replacing a female, you're better off as somebody with high leadership potential in the nonprofit sector. If you're a female, you're better off applying for jobs where you're replacing a male executive director, because you're going to be getting, in net, you'll be earning more in those instances, even though your pay gap compared to your male colleagues might be slightly higher. So again, the general estimates were about 11% across both of these positions. The story is a little bit more nuanced when you're looking at what the baseline group is that's being replaced. But we are using these within organization estimates, looking specifically at these transition periods, which we think is a good way to estimate the specific type of pay gap, which is the instances where two individuals are holding the same position with the same sorts of responsibilities. And in those instances, the gap wouldn't necessarily be a sorting process. It has to do more with compensation practices, or with some sort of compensation being tied maybe to past experience, or other sorts of qualitative characteristics that are attributed to leadership quality, whether those be objective and meaningful, or subjective and biased. In those instances, there's lots of different reasons why that pay gap might exist, even though the person is holding the same position. But that is the kind of the next question that we're trying to explore using some more data from these e-filers, and specifically looking at are there things that nonprofits can do to reduce the pay gap? So if we look at practices across different organizations, do we observe certain practices that tend to lead to lower pay gaps than other organizations that are using alternative practices?
And so we're going to the boards.
Yep.
So one of the first things that we're gonna discuss is the representation on charitable boards in the United States, and really trying to understand whether or not adequate or substantive representation on a charitable board by females might reduce the gender gap in pay among the executive directors who are serving under that board. So we've been working with one of the PhD students at Arizona State, a student of Jesse's, Lenore, to try to understand whether or not the gender balance among those who are responsible for compensating the executive director and who would be monitoring and awarding executive pay impacts the results for the executive directors serving in the organizations.
So it's drawing on Cantor is the primary source of the theory, and the idea is a critical mass theory, which is where if you have no representation of certain minority groups within organizations, then you might observe one set of practices. If you have some representation, it actually can have a negative effect because you have too few and they become token individuals within the organization. So you need a certain threshold of individuals within leadership positions to actually see any changes within an organization.
And the idea here that we might be able to find some point at which the representation on these charitable boards becomes substantively important to the executives that are serving on the board.
So using the same data, what we're able to do here is apply some of that counterfactual analysis to essentially come up with predictions for each director that we have within our data set. And those predictions are if you turn the gender dummy to 1 for male for all of the individuals within the data set. You estimate the model, you come up with the coefficients, and then you just predict what the salaries would be for everybody if they were a male, and then you compare that to what they're actually getting paid. And so that is a representation of the pay gap for each individual within that data set. And so that's based upon their gender, their observed salary, it's within organization estimates. So we're using the lag of the outgoing executive director, and then we have a bunch of organizational characteristics for size and subsector and different financial performance variables to try to make those salary estimates as precise as possible. So that gives us, you can't observe a pay gap within this for a specific individual at any given time unless you're calculating it by some reference point. So that allows us to create that reference point.
So what we find is sort of interesting, and that is that there is a point at which representation does seem to become substantively important to the pay gap, but also that there seems to be a diminishing return on that effect. So as the proportion of female board members rises, and as you look at the bottom of the figure on your screen, moving to the right, we actually see something we didn't expect about the pay gap among these executive directors. But fundamentally, although these are initial results, identifying that the compensation of these boards, the gender compensation of these boards, does seem to have an impact on the salary gaps between men and women serving in these organizations. And that when it becomes substantive, you see there the curve begins somewhere between 20 and 40% representation on the board. We see those pay gaps come down between men and women who are working in these organizations.
Now, we're using panel data to come up with the pay gap estimates here, but this is cross-sectional analysis looking at the proportion of board members. So the limit to this is that the types of organizations that are going to have majority male boards versus the type that are going to have majority female might be different in some ways. So it's hard to, there's a lot of nuance to the interpretation here, but it does give evidence for the critical mass theory, where you do observe pay gap falling once you have a high representation or a critical mass of females serving on the board.
One other thing we were just beginning to look at here is some information that's present in Schedule J of the 990 return of the states, and that is on the compensation practices of the organization. So Schedule J contains additional detail on the salary and compensation packages offered to individuals serving within these organizations. And it also has some indicators of the practices the organizations are using. And it includes things like whether they're using a salary survey to set the compensation of the chief executive officer in the organization, whether or not they're using a consultant, whether or not they've got a compensation committee. So one of the things we were interested in doing is looking at whether or not these organizational practices seem to have any influence on the representativeness of the pay of the males and females serving in these organizations. So as you see up here on the slide, we've got the 990 data coming from Schedule J, and we've got some additional information. And what we're going to talk about today leans very heavily just on the compensation committee, the presence of a consultant, and the use of a salary survey to determine the baseline salary or total compensation of the individual. And these figures are probably not looking all that determinative to you, but here we just see an example. It's a histogram of the base salary of the executive serving in these organizations. And we've got the male salaries overlaid on the female salaries. So the gap that you see on the right-hand side of both figures represents the premium being paid to males in these instances. Now, this is just bivariate look in the first couple of slides that I'm gonna show you. Really just looking at gender and compensation. This is not informed by any other data, but what we see is a premium for the males, and we see that this is exaggerated when the organizations are relying on a consultant to establish the compensation of the individuals. So the effect becomes stronger when we've got a consultant assisting in determining the compensation, with males getting an additional premium on their salary. And here again is a relatively simple model that represents that, but it's got an interaction term in it for the gender of the individual working in the organization and the presence of a consultant who is helping the organization determine pay. And we find significant effects for gender with a 6% premium in this instance. We see another premium if an organization is using a consultant, which may be representative of the resources available to the organization or something else that we're not controlling for in this instance. But when we interact those two variables, we've also found an effect where the males are receiving an additional premium in this particular circumstance where a consultant is helping to determine compensation. So whether these results are determinative, no, certainly not. They're just suggestive and kind of a first cut look at the data, but we're interested to learn more about how these organizational practices, both in the case of the representation on the board and the compensation or hiring mechanisms used by the organization, might influence the equity in compensation between these categories of individuals.
So again, the question is, do these different practices have any impact on the pay gap that we observe? If they use one sort of way to set the salaries of the directors, does it lead to a larger or smaller pay gap than if they're using another sort of methodology? And what we're finding early on is that the compensation surveys tend to be lead to the smallest gaps that we observe, and then things like the use of independent compensation consultants are correlated with higher pay gaps, which is kind of interesting. The compensation committee variable is somewhere in the middle, and this raises questions just about how that committee is structured, what sorts of information they're using, and what sorts of resources they are applying towards understanding kind of what a fair and equitable salary should be.
And it raises the question, tying the two of the two last analyses together, is whether or not a more representative board and a more representative, therefore, compensation committee might have a different effect. But we haven't started to tease that out yet. Again, just kind of the first cut of the data.
So we'll open it up for questions there, but you can kind of see where this research is going. We think that using the replacement data, looking at outgoing versus incoming executive directors, CFOs, that can give us a nice way to understand a fairly precise and robust estimate of what that pay gap is within the nonprofit sector. The nice thing about it as well is that it's using this administrative data. So this opens up the opportunities to look at patterns in the pay gap over time to see if it's changing within the nonprofit sector. And then also we can observe various sorts of organizational practices and governance structures within nonprofits using the e-file data, as well as board composition. So this gives us an opportunity not only to estimate that pay gap, but start to look at some questions about, are there best practices that can help maybe minimize the gap.
One other thing we can add, we didn't have time to include it in the presentation today, but when we look at the CFOs, the gender is much more important to compensation than any sort of financial performance variables that we've been able to include in the models. So we see results for gender, but we don't see results whether or not the organization is financially healthy, really having a major substantive impact on the compensation of the CFO.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you for a really interesting presentation, combining some fascinating data and some interesting causal methods as well. So for questions, we have brought in our speaker from last time, Diarmaid MacDonald from the University of Birmingham, who's going to ask a few questions of both our speakers. So we'll just try and add Diarmaid to the conversation. Diarmaid, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, excellent. I think we can hear you. And you want to unmute there.
Excellent. Thanks very much. The first question I had was, do you think your findings apply to employees at other levels in the nonprofit sector?
Well, it's a little hard to tell in some ways because, well, the data that we have does include other positions. The representativeness of the data within those other categories, it gets worse and worse as you go down the organizational hierarchy. So we can see some gaps among individuals like fundraising professionals who tend to be pretty well compensated and therefore showing up in the compensation data available on the 990. But we're not going to be able to observe that many line workers in these organizations who might be providing services. So that's not something we could really speak to within the data that we've got on hand right now.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to generalize because there are different types of positions and the compensation assumptions and models would probably be pretty different for them. So I could conjecture either way that maybe there's a pay gap in the other direction for some of the work. But I think it would be, we wouldn't be able to do anything with it.
Thank you. Following on from that, what information do you wish was captured in the Form 990 that would help you analyze the pay gap?
Well, there are obviously a lot of things that we're missing, and I don't think many of them could be, we would expect them to be in the 990, but there's a vector of individual characteristics, which obviously we can't speak to. We would love to know more about the individuals who are present in the data if we could build that out. As far as things for me that we could use on the 990 that would help us predict it, we have a very good sense of the financial position of the organization, but we have less of a sense of its position overall, say within its market, its reputation. We lack a lot of measures that might be representative of other aspects of the organization's performance. So for a CFO, we can look at financial performance and get a very good sense of it. But for an executive director, we don't really have measures that are great for trying to understand how well this organization is performing and the other things that it's doing. Obviously, we've got a category of organizations where you're not trying to perform all that well financially in many ways because the excess revenues you're carrying over from year to year are mission left undone in some ways. So, so we really could use better ways to understand the performance of the organization.
One interesting question people raise sometimes is, you can observe kind of the qualifications for the individual. So do they have different degrees, different number of years of management experience, whatever it might be. And if in those cases, would that lead to differences in pay? We're using kind of this definition of pay gap of equal pay for equal work. And so what the literature tells you is that one way to discriminate against women is to ask them what they were making at their previous job and then to pay them relative to that. Because what that does, there are studies that show that when men and women get their first job, oftentimes there's a slight pay premium allocated to men. And then if you think about the compound process of if everyone receives a 3% pay raise each year, but there's a $5,000 pay gap at the initial year, it doesn't take too long for that pay gap to grow larger and larger. And then you add to that the penalties of being out of the workforce for a couple of years to care for children, or not accepting like a promotion because of additional obligations at home, those sorts of things. Those will compound to give resume. They'll make certain resumes look a lot better than others, but the research, it's not conclusive, but there is some suggested research that shows that like years of professional experience is not really predictive of your performance on the job. And so what you really want to be compensating people for is how well they're doing the job, not what different credentials they have on their resume, right? So if you're just competing on performance for the job, we're assuming they're hiring the best person for that position. And in that case, they should be paying them for the position, not whatever previous work they've done. So I'm less concerned about the lack of knowledge on previous professional experience or degrees those individuals hold. But I think the part that would be really useful is any information on what other jobs that person is competing for. Do they have other offers at the time they're accepting this position? Because that can be used for leverage. How aggressively are they negotiating on salary? Those sorts of things would be really helpful. And then, like, if you could just be a fly on the wall of the compensation committee, to get a sense of how they're actually valuing certain attributes of the candidates. Because, I mean, what you see is that some candidates are getting a pay premium when they're being recruited, and others are getting a pay penalty. So are they valuing kind of different credentials in different ways to figure out what that salary is? Like, it seems odd to me that you'd hire a new executive director and pay them less than your other executive director. So there has to be some sort of qualitative analysis that compensation committee is doing to say that person is worth less than the person that they're replacing.
Another thing would be helpful will be to have a longer panel. So as that becomes extended, we could look at multiple transitions. We could chart individuals over time within the data. That might be informative as well. Right now, we don't have quite enough years probably to find too many people that have taken 2 jobs, or too many organizations that have hired and fired a few executive directors.
You mentioned more information on markets, and obviously a lot of non-profits operate at a state level. Is there any opportunity to link in state level non-profit data with what you collect from the federal level?
Well, it's a federal database, but all of the nonprofits are operating. I mean, it's all the nonprofits in the U.S. So it's those that are filing the 990 forms, which any organization that has over 50,000 in revenues is required to file it. So you do observe most of the operating nonprofits that aren't churches and other special categories. So we would have, even though it's federal data, we do have all the. I mean, you can aggregate the nonprofits by state and use some geographic controls for differences in kind of the cost of living in specific areas.
But if you're asking whether there's an opportunity to join in other administrative data that's collected at the state level, it's really not a very rich environment for charitable and nonprofit data in most states. You can find some databases for things like lobbying or contracts. I mean, there are some, but probably not many that are going to help us understand compensation, at least that I'm aware of.
I've got one more. So how do you see the nonprofit open data collective progressing as things move forward?
One thing I think is interesting is when you start your research, you have a question and you're trying to find the best data to answer it. It's really hard to find the appropriate nonprofit data set. Partly, like Urban Institute's National Center for Charitable Statistics is great, and they've actually opened up their databases, which used to be behind a paywall. But when you are starting the research and you go and look at their data sets, they have something like 100 data sets that cover a bunch of different types of data, and each data set has different sets of variables and different samples of organizations, so it can be hard to use that way. Additionally, I mean, there's lots of interesting nonprofit data sets that are just people aren't as aware of because they're not as popular for research. These sorts of things, I think if we have a central place, what we're trying to do is build a website that has a catalog of all of the interesting open data sets related to nonprofits and churches and civic organizations, even like things like federal contracts that might be allocated to nonprofits. If we had all these in one place, I think it would make the research process a little bit easier because you could find the appropriate data for whatever your question is. And then also we start to just create the linkages between researchers who are using this sort of data. So it's easier to figure out how to reach out to ask a question if you're confused about what a specific variable means or what a sample, how a sample is created, that sort of thing.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got a few questions from the YouTube comments. So I wonder if I could just ask some of them now before we wrap up. So first one was an observation that presumably the incoming candidate will be aware of the salary of the person they're replacing, and so that might affect negotiation strategies. Does this mean do you see differences by the field type or age or size of a nonprofit? And then just adding on to that, I think you touched on it a little bit. Where do you take this research further? Is there complementary qualitative research to dig a bit deeper?
Gotcha. I guess to begin with the first part of the question, well, actually,
yeah, we definitely observe differences across the subsectors and across geographies, and organizational size. I'm not sure if the pay gap is pretty consistent across organizational size in percentage terms, but it's obviously different in absolute terms. But yeah, there are differences across some of those categories.
And we're controlling for size in all these models, and then we're excluding the eds and the meds and looking within category. But we've run some cross-sectional models that are moderated by subsector as well, and those results are also consistent. Until you get into organizations where there are civil rights focused on women's issues or gender issues, where we see the gender coefficient go away, but otherwise we see significant and substantively significant premiums for males in all these organizational types. Not in the more elaborate models that we presented here, because we start to lose observations. But again, generally 10, 11% premium for males stands up consistently across the data and then over time.
And there's definitely lots of room for additional research in this area, especially qualitative stuff. I think if you're able to study compensation committees, we can't observe we can observe the board members, but we can't observe who sits on the compensation committee, even though we can see if they have one. So that information would be useful, but even more so just understanding kind of what happens in that room as they're making these decisions. There's lots of bias in terms of what leadership qualities look like and what actually makes a good director or a CFO. So it might be the case that the compensation is being based upon mental models of people that would be good in positions, but it doesn't necessarily correlate with how they actually perform. Those sorts of things, just understanding kind of how that discussion plays out and what sorts of information that they're focused in on when they're making those sorts of decisions, I think would be hugely useful in terms of understanding how that compensation is set.
If there's any kind of signaling the organizations are doing when they're searching for individuals and making a replacement through recruitment mechanisms, et cetera, I think that would be interesting as well.
Okay, we have a second question then. Is it possible to look at the chronological interactions of male to female position change and then say back from female to male? So do you have enough longitudinal data to look at multiple?
Yeah, we, because you're missing the transition year and because we only have like a 5 or 6 year panel at this point, we tried to do that and we ended up with like 8 or 10 cases. They actually fit with what you'd expect. If it's a female to male to female, it increases and then decreases again, and a male to male, it decreases and then increases again. But you're talking about a couple of observations for each of those groups, so they were pretty much, there's nothing we could say conclusively about that. But yes, as a panel grows, that's a really good way to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, within the data set we have now, that's a lot of high-level executive transitions in a very short period of time. So the most significant coefficient would probably be dumpster fire. Like it's a really bad sign for the organization. They're probably substantially different in many ways from the rest of the population.
And then final question, are you able to make any sorts of comparisons with pay gaps in the for-profit and or public sector? Do you think the pay gap would be similar? Do you think it's bigger or smaller?
The estimates are kind of all over the board. It depends upon what you look at, because some of this research is done using Department of Labor data, but then you're looking at a lot of mid-level managers. So you'd want a data set that's specifically looking at executive directors, CEOs, CFOs. There's some instances where it's like approximately 10% pay gap at those levels, which is similar to what we see. But lots of variation in terms of what different studies find. I think if you wanted to look at that, what you should do is to pull hospital data, for example, and then you could compare for-profits to nonprofits directly, looking at CEO pay in those organizations.
I'm really not aware of private sector studies where they're looking at the executive transitions either. I mean, there could be some out there that I've missed, but I think that would be interesting because that gives us sort of a different comparison to many studies, and I would be curious to know whether that was consistent across sectors. But the way that we're defining it and then specifying it is a little bit different than the way many others have.
Okay, so perfectly on time. That brings us to the end of our second seminar. I'd like to thank both Jesse and Nathan for their really interesting presentation, Diarmid for posing some questions as a discussant, and also to the viewers for posting questions in the comments. That's really good to get some interaction and some questions. I'd like to thank Beth Bloodgood at Concordia University, who's given us a room to get together for this broadcast. And of course, I'd like to thank all the viewers who watched this live. And feel free to share it with others who might like to watch the recording afterwards. As I've said before, this is our second seminar, so this is a bit of an experiment. So we're still getting our head around exactly how it'll work and the technology, but I hope you found it useful and interesting. Recording of the session will be available at this same YouTube link shortly after the session, so please do share it with anyone else that you think might be interested. And if you would be interested in presenting your own work using non-profit data, then please do contact me. The details are in the description below. We'll be back next month on the 22nd of November when Jürgen Willems will be presenting his work, working with data on directors and CEOs. So thank you again, and goodbye.